Hi there, and you are watching me on YouTube and Facebook Live. I'm a business analyst and freelance writer. More than 200 business, academic, and research articles are published under my name. It's the third episode of Globalization and History of Globalization. In the first episode, we discussed in detail about ancient globalization in the known history, or whatever we know today. That why people call Alexander the Great. It is because of his engineering skill and engineering, and we have also established the fact in the first episode that engineering was the main reason behind globalization. And in the second episode, we discussed an overview of the whole Middle and Dark Ages, that there were wars everywhere and historical records were missing. And we don't know what happened exactly in the Middle Ages, but there were wars, there was bloodshed, and people from raiding from one part of the world to the other part. It was wars and blood everywhere. Millions of people died in the Middle Ages and Dark Ages. And it's the third episode, and today we are going to talk about, we will focus on the Mongolian Empire and the Viking Empire. Mongolian Empire, 13th and 14th century, was the prime time and flourishing period of, of the Mongolian Empire. And the Viking Empire comprises of from 8th century to 11th and 12th century. And we would also discuss very interesting facts about the economics, about whale oil, rust, road, and many other details. And it is going to be a very interesting episode today. And my guest is Edward Konovics.
Yeah, hi, Hassan and everyone.
Hi, hi
I,
Ed,
I
how
think
are
we're going to
you?
find a lot of interesting facts. I think a lot of things have been buried in history
Mhm,
that we don't know
mhm.
about. And it
Yes.
takes a lot of reading of a lot of pages
Mhm,
and looking things up, and eventually you come to some truth.
mhm.
But the
Uh,
dark ages
I,
were not dark. They were
mhm,
hidden.
mhm.
So we should
Uh, uh,
really call them the hidden ages.
It's a very interesting, you said a very good thing. The Dark Ages were not dark, they were hidden. Even in until 1890, we know historian of all time throughout the whole period from 8th century to the 19th century, they were simply avoiding, they were calling the Mongolians and the Vikings raiders, and they were bloodthirsty people. But in fact, they were very organized and they were very engineering. Their engineering skills were remarkable. Don't you agree?
Yes, I think what happened to history was controlled by Roman Catholic monks. So
Mm-hmm.
we got all our history through the the bias of the
Mm-hmm.
Roman Catholic Church. So we didn't get real history. We
Mm-hmm.
got propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
Now we always get propaganda, but most historians try to at least cover the technology.
Mm-hmm.
And we have the development in the dark or hidden ages of about three or four technologies, and which is the pre-industrial revolution. And what the
Mm-hmm.
Vikings had started, and that's the Scandinavian countries, what they had started was um, whaling. And
Mm-hmm.
whale oil was needed to as a lubricant for all fine machinery. So if you have a windmill, you have gears putting the power of the windmill to the grinder to grind flour. You need to lubricate that. If you have a gun,
So,
you need to
mm-hmm.
lubricate it. And guns were developed during the Dark Ages by China.
Mm-hmm.
And because the West wants to see China as inferior because of the racism of the West,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the 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 technology that the Mongols used were ignored. They had cannons.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they could conquer from China all the way to Kiev and all the
Mm-hmm.
way down to Baghdad, all the way across to Turkey. They had superior technology.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the
And
interesting thing,
you said about whale oiling. Was it discovered in the earlier period or was it discovered later in the 14th or 15th
oh,
century?
it was used 200 years before the Vikings. In fact, it was
Mm-hmm.
discovered in BC. There's a proto European culture between the
Mm-hmm.
French and the Spanish,
Mm-hmm.
Spain and Portugal, right along the Pyrenees.
Mm-hmm.
It's called the Basques. And the
Mm-hmm.
Basques, who have the European, original European language, not related to Latin, not related to German, not related to Slavic. It's, they're one of the original cultures of Europe. And
Mm-hmm.
they had basically been whaling, which was they
Mm-hmm.
were chasing whales into bays and killing them in bays and burning or heating their blubber down to oil. And this was
Mm-hmm.
the oil used for lamps. If you were going to read at night or a dark room, you needed whale oil. So
Mm-hmm.
just how important oil, like in the Middle East, is today. Whale
Mm-hmm.
oil was that important. In fact,
Uh,
sperm
it, it,
oil
mhm.
from whales was needed to lubricate guns in World War One.
I heard that it was animal fat like the bulls and cows. It was their fat that was used as a oil in to lit the candle at night and other things.
Well, that was used two candles,
Hmm.
but candles don't give much light, and
Hmm.
those who were wealthier afforded these rather elaborate oil lamps.
Hmm.
And there's different accounts. Some say that the whale oil, stunk or smelled, and others
Hmm.
say it didn't. And of
Hmm.
course, after the oil wells were dug, people were using kerosene lamps. But before the kerosene lamps, there was some turpentine lamps,
Hmm.
but whale oil was generally the preferred method of reading. You had a whale oil lamp.
Hmm.
And if you made any
So,
complex mechanical equipment, like a gun, you needed
mhm.
whale oil or sperm oil from the sperm
so
whale.
so it was an whale oil was the product or was a fancy thing at that time of the elite class.
Yeah, I think what let me start with history. The
Okay.
economics is hidden. There's about
Mhm.
three or four developments that happen that are hidden in history. They're not secret. You can find them. So
Mhm.
anything I'll mention here, I found on the internet. I found in just in those encyclopedias, but you have to know where to look,
Mhm.
which is and I gave you some links, and I'm sure you were amazed how different things are than what you thought, which is what we
Yes.
hear on television or the History Channel is not that true. Is, for
Yes, you were
example,
right.
the Silk Road. If you ask most people what was China exporting on the Silk Road, what would they say? Silk.
Silk.
But really, it wasn't true
Mhm.
because silk was only affordable by the super wealthy. It was not a common good,
Mhm.
which is the average person in Europe or the Mediterranean did not wear silk. But
Mhm.
porcelain, dishes, pots, China developed porcelain and kept the process secret for 1,000 years.
So China didn't want another competition in the market. That's why they use Silk Road uh, as something. What do we call it? As a disguise, as a cover story.
Yeah, the Silk Road is sort of a cover story for spices, and people think opium comes from China. No, the English before the Byzantine the Byzantine Empire
Mhm.
and which was Greek, try
Mhm.
to get China addicted to opium,
Mhm.
which is the
And
porcelains and spices were coming into Europe, and
mhm.
they wanted China to import opium. But what was the real precious commodity was tin, because tin
Mhm.
is hard to find, and making bronze, which is mixing tin and copper,
Mhm.
is a preferred method of using metal. Most of the bronze statues. But what I like to start with is the collapse
Mhm.
of the Roman Empire.
Mhm.
And the collapse of the Roman Empire is really the collapse of Christendom. It used to be called Christendom because there was two parts of the
Mhm.
Roman Empire. There was the East or Greek part, which is the Greeks had risen in their influence, and there was the Roman part.
So
And
was it in the Middle Ages, or was it before Middle Ages,
well, it's
or Middle
considered the
Ages?
Middle Ages, but it's
Mhm.
about 700, I think it is,
Mhm.
that
So it
we
was.
begin. Well, the a little bit before the Middle Ages, about 333, I think, King Emperor Constantine
Mhm.
moved the capital to Istanbul in Turkey or
Mhm.
Anatolia, depending on how you what period you go to.
Okay.
And
Constantinople.
then
Okay.
about and this continued. People still were in the Roman Empire, but there was two of them. In
Mhm.
fact, at times there was two emperors, which was Charlemagne was crowned emperor, and he
Mhm.
was a Frank or German.
Mhm.
So Charlemagne was the emperor of the West, and then there
Mhm.
was another. I think it was an empress, Eileen or something, was in the East. So these two really waged war against each other.
Mhm.
Basically, the Roman Empire was divided between the Greek section, emphasizing Turkey, and of course,
Mhm.
Greece and the Greek islands,
Mhm.
and the Roman section, which emphasized Italy and Spain and Portugal. Spain and Portugal were important, just like England was important because of the tin mines.
Mhm.
Tin was not a precious metal, but a real needed metal that was very rare, that was very difficult to find. Everyone
Mhm.
wanted tin. You
Mhm.
know, people talk about gold and silver, but
Mhm.
tin was much more important because
So what?
bronze was so workable.
So what was tin used in? What was it used in?
Tin was
Okay.
used in armor and everything. Art,
Mhm.
your big statues or bronze statues.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
used in weapons. See,
Mhm.
iron itself is real porous and heavy,
Mhm. Mhm.
and
So
and and
tin is light.
well, you mix tin with copper,
Mhm.
and
Then
you get
you.
bronze, which is
Mhm.
called the Bronze Age.
Mhm.
And so a lot of tools and equipment was made from bronze. Then Iron Age required a certain skill in getting carbon into the iron because iron is too heavy, too brittle, very difficult to use. So you wanted steel. And
Mhm.
the history of steel is somewhat secretive, which is the Japanese developed very good samurai swords. And it was how the
Mhm.
blacksmith used charcoal
Mhm.
particularly, and how they hammered it, depending on how good of a blade they got. And this is why I think the Vikings were so powerful. The Vikings were used by the Dark Ages as mercenaries. They were hired
Mhm.
killers.
A Viking?
The
Was it
Vikings were hired
Viking?
killers. And
Vikings were mercenaries. What about Mongolians? Were they also mercenaries?
yeah, the Mongolians were mercenaries for the Chinese, but
Mhm.
mercenaries like Attila the Hun and the
Mhm.
rest of them often turned on the people who are paying them.
Mhm.
So basically, mercenaries say, "Well, we have the army. Why aren't we in power?"
Mhm.
And if we look at the Vikings are from Scandinavia, which is Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, They
Mhm.
were the guards
Mhm.
on the emperors in Byzantium, which is now Istanbul or
Mhm.
Constantinople. The
Mhm.
guards of the emperor in Turkey were Vikings.
Mhm.
They're called Varangians. So you look
Mhm.
up Varangians, the Varangian Guard, which was the elite troops of the Emperor of Rome in Turkey, were
Mhm.
Vikings.
And there's one thing I would like to add here. Uh, when we talk about the Muslim power, the Muslims in Baghdad, and at that time, they were also the Muslim Empire. They also used to hire Turkish people as their guards, and when they approached higher ranks of power, and they thought that we are the Medes. Why are we protecting the foreign leaders? So they took over the Muslim Empire and they moved it to Turkey. That's the story of that's how the Ottoman Empire began.
But the Turks, I think, language relates to the Mongolian language in some ways. So
Mhm.
the Ottoman Empire and even modern Turkey is somewhat
Mhm.
the remains of parts of the Mongolian Empire
Mhm.
and
Or
previous
also,
Mongol. Let me make a major point. Why were the Vikings, and you won't find this in history. I
mhm,
found this by doing research in
mhm,
Iceland, and I'm a sports fan, not a big one,
mhm,
but in strongman competition, the major strongest men in the world are from Iceland, England, Lithuania, Estonia, Sweden,
mhm,
Norway, and it's not
mhm,
uncommon for them to be 6 foot 5, 7 feet tall, weigh 300
mhm.
pounds.
Yes.
And this was even William Wallace of the Scots, because Scotland was invaded many times by the Vikings.
Mhm,
William Wallace, the movie with Mel Gibson. I forget what the
mhm,
name of the movie was. Let me look it up.
Braveheart,
Braveheart,
Braveheart.
yeah. So
Yes,
Braveheart, Mel Gibson's short. I think he's 5'10"
yes,
or
yes,
something.
yes.
But the original William Wallace was 6'5" or 7 feet tall.
Mhm,
And the reason I think the Vikings were tall, they were 6'5". So you can't find this in history. They claim the
mhm,
average Viking was 5'10". I don't believe that. So what
mhm,
happened is these steel weapons, if you
mhm,
look at what the Romans used, they used a short sword. And the reason
mhm,
why they used a short sword, that's a
mhm,
tongue, is they could use it in battle all day long because it didn't weigh that much.
mhm,
And so a shield it was a skill to move that fast. I forget the name of the Roman sword. Let me look it up. But they had this short, small sword that was very efficient.
mhm.
And I think the it's called the gladius. That's why I wanted to look it up. The
Okay.
gladius, and you get gladiator from it. The gladius was pretty short,
Mhm.
but the Vikings could have bigger swords because they were bigger,
Yes.
and
And
they could wield it as fast. And since they were really big, 6'5", 300 pounds, the smaller Romans couldn't really engage them well in battle.
yes, and they had a remarkable skill of boarding, and they used to build long and wide and deeper boards.
I didn't repeat that. I got interference. They used to
Okay.
build wide and equal what?
They used to build bigger ships, wide, long, and deep ships.
Yeah,
Yes,
and
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 it was the main reason behind behind from moving from Scandinavia to the Eastern Europe and many other parts of the world.
The 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 issue was for
Mhm,
Europe was glass, not porcelain. Glass is a much better storage than pots
mhm, mhm,
from ceramics. If you made a ceramic pot, it
mhm,
it it didn't clean as well as glass. We use
mhm,
glasses today, and it preserves our food and it's cleaner. We can clean, glass pans, glass bowls,
mhm,
glass jars. So glass was an important production of Northern Europe, particularly the Dutch,
mhm,
and lenses, protective lenses. These
mhm,
are like sunglasses I wear to block the blue light. They're
mhm.
not they're not actual lenses, which is there's no correction in them. But
Okay.
let's get back. So the Roman Empire is split in two, east
Mhm,
and west. And the emperor was in the east, which was Turkey, and his bodyguards were Vikings. They were called
mhm,
Varangians. And the reason why I think they were his guards, they were big.
mhm,
They were an elite force of very large people, and it's hard for a small person to
mhm,
wield a large sword. And if you wield a large sword, you almost use it like a hammer, particularly against a shield. And so
mhm,
I think a large sword, if you had the strength to hold it, was more effective. The short
mhm,
sword was more effective in combat against the same size person because the same size person using a big sword couldn't move it for long.
mhm,
Sword way too much.
mhm,
So, and these little simple things are missing in history. One of
mhm,
the other things missing is the Vikings probably traded whale oil. And I
mhm,
think a lot of wars were because people did not honor the contract, which is, let's say the Vikings delivered whale oil to the French. Then they
mhm,
expected from the French, let's say, tin.
mhm.
And if the French didn't reply with the tin, I think they went and raided them. So
Yes.
I think a lot of wars were based upon currency or, checks. There wasn't no credit cards.
Mhm,
There was a lot of economic imbalance, and merchants had expected a return. And when they didn't get their return, they waged
they wage a
war.
war. Yes.
And one of the big mercantilists or businesses during the Dark Ages was Venice, the
Mhm,
Venetians. This is
mhm.
where the Crusades came from. A lot of the Crusades were financed by the Venetians. Would you guess what the major product of Venice was?
What was it?
It was salt.
Mhm.
It was a
Salt.
major empire. They had an
Yes.
order originally for the Fourth Crusade. They were going to make 1,000 ships
Mhm. For the salt.
for the largely for the Lombards. The
Mm,
Lombards, the word Lombard comes from long beard,
mhm,
and the long beards were Vikings. The
mhm.
Romans shaved.
Okay.
So the barbarians, the Barbarossa, which is
Okay.
the red beards. So
Mhm,
Barbarossa meant red beard. So the Lombards had long beards. And unlike what you see on TV, the Vikings were well groomed. They did not have shaggy beards. They were very
mhm,
well groomed.
mhm,
But they were seen as the bearded ones or Lombards. And they
mhm.
tend to have red hair. So they were seen as the Rus, which is
Yes.
modern Russia, really is not the remains, the outgrowth of the Viking Empire. I'm going to cover that. But before I get
Okay.
there, for us
Okay.
to get to the Viking and Mongol empires, which were mercenary troops that were used by China and the Romans as paid
Okay.
soldiers, they were basically expert soldiers. The Vikings, because of their size, that's my opinion,
Mhm.
which is they could wield stronger swords and shields, and in close combat that made a big difference. So
Mhm.
they were an elite guard, the Vikings. They were called
Mhm.
the Lombards, the Rus, the Varangians. They had many different names throughout
But
Europe,
yes,
but
they
they were
have
all
different
from
names.
Scandinavia.
Yes, and they also established many small kingdoms, and they were finished all over the
Yes,
Europe.
like
Mhm.
Normandy, meaning the Norman or the Norsemen.
Mhm.
Normandy, France, was established largely by the Vikings.
Mhm.
So when William the Conqueror in 1066,
Mhm.
William of Orange conquered England, that was Vikings, but they were from
Mhm.
France. They had resettled in France. So the
Yes.
Viking and Mongol, now the Mongols were different.
Mhm.
The Mongols were nomads like the
Mhm.
Arabs
Mhm.
or Bedouin, and they were highly
Mhm.
skilled and small with the horses and skilled in using a bow and arrow. And
Mhm.
as a result of this, they're very mobile armies, which is
Mhm.
they went all the way thousands of miles from China all the way to Kiev, Russia, because they traveled with their herds and their
Mhm.
tents. Their tents were called yurts. So they
Mhm.
were used to this. They lived as nomads, moving their herds and their horses and their equipment in wagons. They were
Mhm.
used to moving, and because they were used to moving,
Mhm.
they could easily transit
Settle.
to army.
Yes, they could
So
easily move from one part of the world to the other because they are accustomed to moving to nomad lands.
right, and they're moving with their herds. This
Yes.
is not mentioned in history. See,
Yes.
when the Roman formed an army, or when the Greeks formed an army, they had
Mhm.
to scavenge the countryside for food. They had to conquer cities for their granaries. They didn't have a food supply. Their army could be
Mhm.
starved.
Mhm.
But the Mongols traveled with their herds, their food supply.
Mhm.
And because of this mobility, they were very successful soldiers. But there's one thing missing. You won't find this in history unless you dig really deep.
Mhm.
The Chinese developed gunpowder as early as 200 AD, which is,
Mhm.
is very likely
Mhm.
that the Mongols had cannons,
Mhm.
which is the Mongolian Empire was the first to use modern warfare, which is gunpowder, guns, and cannon.
Mhm. Mhm.
This is hidden from history.
And
The reason why it's hidden
it, it is
is
also
racism.
yeah, it is because the reason it is hidden, it is because they didn't want it to show it to the world. They didn't want anyone else to have the same product, to have the same weapon just like they have.
Yeah, so China hid it like they hid how to make porcelain, but
Hmm.
also the West hid it. They hide it
Hmm.
today because China was superior in science and engineering. The West,
Hmm.
the European countries did not want to admit that the Chinese were superior.
Hmm.
So we have the development of gunpowder,
Hmm.
porcelain, China. So what do you get from China? China. And that's
Yes.
sort of hidden. And
Hmm.
what the West tried to do was destroy the culture. They try to get
Hmm.
China addicted to opium. People don't know this. Do you know what was
Yes.
the major source of opium? What country? Egypt.
Egypt.
And
Okay.
during the Dark Ages, Egypt, one of its major products was poppies and opium.
Hmm.
And of course, later opium was even grown a lot in Turkey. We think opium in terms of Afghanistan and
Mm-hmm.
China, but really the East Indian Company controlled Afghanistan, Pakistan, and
In
India,
India.
where poppies were grown, and they waged war against China because they developed better cannons. They brought their
Mm-hmm.
navy in, waged war against China to keep opium legal, because in trading and getting all the, the spices, the porcelain, the silk from
Mm-hmm.
China, they wanted to export opium, which is a cash heavy crop.
Mm-hmm.
So the Middle East and we see this with Iran, correctly charge historically England and the United States as drug pushers. And
Mm-hmm.
today the drug companies of Europe and the United States dominate the world, including dominate India and China. The West
Mm-hmm.
were drug pushers. The West pushed opium on the world, and now they push opioids and the pharmaceutical companies and vaccines. So we're
Mm-hmm.
still
So
dealing with drug
yes,
war.
the time is changed, but the reason behind waging a war, or the concept of war, or the main weapon of war is the same.
Yeah, the concept underlying war, I think, is economics, not
Yes,
profit,
yes,
but fair trade, which is the
yes,
Mongolian Empire secured the Silk Road. The
yes.
Silk Road was subject to thieves, robbery, different countries not paying, different countries putting tolls. The Mongolian Empire, sort of like communism, sort of like the Soviet Union,
Mm,
secured the trade,
mhm,
which was the state was in control. You know, the large empire was in control now of the Silk Road.
mhm,
So we're dealing with administration, which was the Mongolian Empire, particularly Kublai Khan,
mhm,
um, were experts at administering public utilities.
I also found out that Genghis Khan was a very intellectual person. He established uh, a democratic form of government during during his time in the 13th and 14th century.
Well, sort of parliamentary, they people had to get together in like a parliament.
Yes,
I wouldn't call it a democratic government.
yes,
I would call it a meritocracy, which
okay.
was
Meritocracy.
it was based upon your competency rather
Hmm.
than based upon just who you knew or politics. Both Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan, to be successful generals, they had
Hmm.
to be concerned with the competence of who was the lower officers and who
Hmm.
were the managers. So
Hmm.
they were very skilled at administration. They were skilled managers.
Yes,
And so that's why they could manage all of China, because they were very skilled at this. But people
yes.
need to, first of all, understand during the darker hidden ages, China was progressing in technology.
Hmm.
Well, it was the dark ages for Europe, and it was
Hmm.
dark there because they couldn't compete with the East,
With
with
China.
China. And
Yes,
that's the same thing with India.
yes,
India and China both had advanced technologies,
yes,
and what the Arabs with the Islamic Empire brought some of the Indian and Chinese technology
yes.
to the West.
Hmm. So
So
Arab Middle East was the center point between East and West, and that's why the Western theologian and Western historians were focusing on their focus was on the Middle East, and the whole history is comprised of the wars in the Middle East. and Europe and Middle East.
Yeah, because of the trading.
Yes.
And the beginning of the Dark Ages really was from the Fourth Crusade. In fact, I'm
Mhm,
going to open it to get the data correct. The Fourth Crusade, I wouldn't call it sponsored because they charged a lot of money
mhm,
against the Crusaders,
mhm,
was from Venice, which is
mhm,
the west coast of Italy. And Venice was a major power because it traded in salt. Salt was a
mhm.
necessary commodity, and
For
salt
preserving food.
and the Venetians monopolized the salt trade. And they
Mhm,
funded the Crusades in order to try to control, particularly the major port of Alexandria, Egypt.
mhm,
Alexandria, Egypt, and Rhodes. Rhodes was an island controlled by the Greeks outside of Turkey. It was about 11 miles from Turkey.
mhm,
There you have a Rhodes scholar. It's from
mhm,
Cecil Rhodes. But
mhm,
the island of Rhodes was a major port. There was two major ports. One was Alexandria, Egypt. The other one was Rhodes, the island of Rhodes. In fact, the
mhm.
state in the United States is named after it, Rhode Island.
The Rhode Islands.
And they had the Colossus of Rhodes, which was a huge bronze statue. And the guy who made the Colossus of Rhodes was the personal sculptor of Alexander the Great.
Mhm,
But what Rhodes fought and was famous for, they fought against General Demetrius, who was a Greek general under Alexander the Great, which
mhm,
is the Greek island Rhodes fought the Greek general Demetrius because they didn't want to be under a global empire. So the island of Rhodes was a symbol of independence, like the United States. Though they were English, the US, they wanted to be independent of the English Empire, and the island of Rhodes wanted to be independent of the Greek Empire.
mhm,
So independence was not seen as human rights, it was seen as being independent of central control, which was decentralization,
mhm.
which is, we're not taught that in
So,
history. We're not
so
taught
here
the empire is a problem. We're taught the empire is good and the empire
empire.
brings peace.
Now I think, and they were hiring. Uh, the Roman Empire was divided in two parts: western and eastern side. The eastern side was hiring Mongolians as paid mercenaries, and the western
So
side they were hiring.
well, the Roman Empire, the eastern part was both the east and the west hired Vikings.
Yes.
In the west, it was called the Lombards, which meant
Mhm.
long beard. And in the east, which is Constantinople, it was the Varangians. And they were
Yes.
Vikings, they were mercenaries. China
Mhm.
hired the Mongols as mercenaries.
Okay.
And China and Chinese engineers went with the
Mhm.
Mongols to attack even the city of Kiev. And
Mhm.
these cities had fortifications. And it's my conjecture, and
Mhm.
there's a lot of historical support. The reason why the Mongols were so effective in destroying European cities,
Mhm.
they used gunpowder, they had explosives.
Mhm.
And that was hidden because of the racism of the West. They didn't want to admit that the Chinese and the Mongols had superior technology.
Mhm. And there was also one other power. It was emerging in the background. It was Rurk or RURK or Rurk or Rick. I don't know
Yeah,
however you
Rorik,
call it.
Prince Rorik. Yeah, they were
Yes.
Vikings. They
Yeah, they were
founded
also Vikings.
Novgorod
Yeah.
and then eventually Moscow. which
Mm-hmm.
is the Viking Empire really converted itself into
Mm-hmm.
Russia. The Rus
Yes.
are the Vikings.
Yes.
So Russia is the land of the Rus, which is the land of the Vikings.
So, so it means the Middle Ages, they were only two major powers, the Vikings and the Chinese or
Yes,
Mongolians.
after the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman
Yes.
Empire really fell with the Fourth Crusade.
Mm-hmm.
Let me read this a little bit. The
Mm-hmm.
Fourth Crusade was 1202 to 1204, which is called the 13th century, the beginning of it. It
Mm-hmm.
was the Latin Christians that attacked first Zara in what was Hungary at the time, and then they sacked Constantinople, which is basically the Greek and the Roman Catholic empires were at war with each other. They attacked each other in 1200s, and at the same time, the Roman Empire and the Greek Roman Empire were waging war on each other. The
Mm-hmm.
Vikings and the Mongols arose as a power,
Mm-hmm.
and and it's still today. For a while, Russia occupied Mongolia.
Yes. And
So,
what about this is a very interesting thing that they even today 98% of the Mongolians they support Russians. They have a favorable views about Russia.
well, I
And
think um, Kublai Khan was a
mhm,
Tibetan Buddhist,
mhm,
and Buddhists really don't believe in a god.
mhm,
They don't believe in monotheism.
mhm,
So I think what we're seeing is the Buddhism that the
mhm,
Mongol invasion largely represented.
mhm,
The Mongols were closest to those. Some were Islamics in the west
mhm,
part of the empire. The Khans tended to become Islamic.
mhm.
The major part of Mongolian thinking was more Buddhist, like the
Mhm.
Chinese. And I
It-
think the
it-
Buddhism, I
mhm.
think the Buddhism converted to communism.
This is a very interesting thing that what happened when Mongolia accepted Russia in 1923 or 1927 during 19 in the period of 1920s, and Buddhist was the target of communist government. They were targeting Buddhists and their monastery all over Mongolia, and they killed I don't know many Buddhists.
Yeah, because there were more towards, and we see this in Genghis and Kublai Khan, they were more administrators. They were
Yes,
more like the communists. They were more concerned with the bureaucracy than the religious belief.
yes,
So what we're having with communist China and communist Soviet Union, we were
hmm
seeing the influence of Buddhist thinking, and
hmm
um, the Buddhist thinking was basically more bureaucratic.
hmm
And,
I don't
and
call
we
it.
saw that in Vietnam. Vietnam went from Buddhism to communism.
We I think we shouldn't call it Buddhist, and because uh, when uh, when a country accept communism, Buddhists are and their monasteries are the become the main target of the
Yeah,
communist
they
government.
do. They do
Yes.
because there's a so-called privileged class,
Hmm.
and the super wealthy in Tibet were the monks,
Hmm.
the monasteries.
Hmm.
Often, even in Europe, the wealth was concentrated in monasteries.
Hmm. Just like
So,
just like today in if you look at Saudi or the rich Muslim countries, uh, the powerful people are Muslim. So it's the same thing with Buddhists. The elite class belongs to the Buddhist religion or Buddhist belief. And when a communist government comes into power, they become their monasteries become the main target.
Yeah. The thing is to see a historical process. The Mediterranean influence basically diminished with the fall of the Roman Empire. And the
Hmm.
fall of the Roman Empire, which took to about 1500 AD, which is the end of the Dark Ages, was the
Hmm.
Roman Empire divided into two parts. The Latin part around Italy and Spain and Portugal and France, and the Greek part around Turkey, Greece, and a large part of the Greek part of the Roman Empire merged with Russia and the Vikings.
Hmm.
The Greek Catholics that were based in Turkey and Constantinople, they moved
Hmm.
north and made an
Hmm.
agreement. They already were using the Vikings as their elite guard or force. So the Greek Orthodox transferred itself to Russian Orthodox. So
Hmm.
there was a unification of the Eastern Roman Empire, which was Greek, with the Vikings, which became Russia.
Hmm.
Russia, and you're not going to read this.
Yes.
It's there, but it should be a title of a chapter or a book. The
Hmm.
Greek Catholic Church moved from Turkey to Russia,
Russia.
and that was an alignment between the Byzantine Greeks and the Vikings.
Hmm.
So modern Russia is the result of the two. The Vikings are the Rus, and the Greek Orthodox, which became Russian Orthodox. And the Mongolian influence, I think, resulted in communism,
Hmm.
which was a heavy emphasis on the military, a heavy emphasis on bureaucracy.
Hmm.
But what communism was a step from feudalism, which is warlords like Genghis Khan, to
Hmm.
capitalism and oligarchs. Right now, Russia is largely ruled by oligarchs, and China is becoming a country of oligarchs to some extent. Not that
Hmm.
much. The Chinese government is more powerful than the oligarchs. The oligarchs are still being prosecuted and going to jail. They're not
Hmm.
in the United States. The oligarchs in the United States are not being prosecuted at all, but they are
Yes.
being
And
prosecuted in China.
hmm.
But what we see is the Roman Empire collapsing into two parts, a Greek and a Latin. The Greek
Hmm.
part was
Went to Russia.
defended by the
The
Varangians, the Vikings, and they moved north to Russia. And Russia
Mhm.
was founded by Rorik, Prince
Mhm.
Rorik, who was a Viking from Scandinavia.
Yes, and they
So,
were three brothers. They
yeah,
were
and
three
they
brothers.
also founded the Duchy of
Yes,
Muscovy, of
yes,
Moscow.
yes.
So we're still dealing with the Vikings, the Russians, but
Mhm.
with the Greek Orthodox, which is the Russian Orthodox Church,
Mhm.
combination of the two. And the
Mhm.
big thing with the Vikings, they were good with steel. They were
Mhm.
good making. They were good with metallurgy. And in
Mhm.
order to make the machines and gears at
Mhm.
that time, 1,000 years ago, you needed whale oil. Whale
Mhm.
oil was a major product.
Mhm.
You can see that in the United States with New England, and you see that in the novel Moby Dick by Melville, which is about killing a white whale. The
Mhm.
whale oil was pre-industrial revolution. Once we
Mhm.
had coal and oil, then we had the industrial revolution. But the
Mhm.
pre-industrial revolution was built on killing of whales. In fact,
Mhm.
Soviet Union, this is like from 1917 or around 1920, until
Mm-hmm.
about 1990 had killed over 100,000 whales.
Oh my.
Whales,
Even in the 20th century?
yes, the 20th
Mm-hmm.
century, the
Mm-hmm.
Soviet Union killed over 100,000 whales. There's
For
only two
what?
countries commercially whaling today. It's Iceland and
Mm-hmm.
Norway, and both are
Mm-hmm.
Viking.
Okay.
The only
They,
two countries using whale commercially is Norway and Iceland, though Japan is claiming they're doing scientific studies. They're actually whale.
okay.
And of course, American native peoples and New Zealand, the Maori, there are other people that are allowed to do whaling.
Mm-hmm.
But the whale oil was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, pre industrial revolution. And China, particularly with gunpowder and other inventions, China led that revolution to some extent. And that was the Mongol invasion. They had superior technology
Mm-hmm.
and
So,
they had a superior bureaucracy.
the whale oil is missing all over in the Middle Ages, or was it the reason they wanted the Vikings wanted to keep the whale oil hidden? It
Well, there
was it
were,
their main was it their
well,
main purpose
I
to
think what is, it's not what is hidden here. It's
mm-hmm,
what's promoted. And
mm-hmm,
what we were being taught by the Roman Empire, which is the Roman Catholic Church, was might is right. The size of your army made the difference. So
yes,
we come to the conclusion from reading history, it's all about armies and war, and it isn't. It's
mm-hmm,
more about economics. What
yes,
made Venice so powerful was not armies or navies.
mm-hmm,
So they had a strong navy,
mm-hmm,
was their salt trade, was their
mm-hmm,
ability to carry on trades and contracts. And
mm-hmm,
I think a lot of the wars were the result of the breakdown of trade by people not honoring their contracts. So I
mm-hmm,
don't think war was a bunch of raiders and
mm-hmm.
bullies trying to kill people. That's what we're taught in history. We're taught
Yes,
in history
yeah,
that
the
armies are a
main
bunch of bullies out to kill people and steal from them.
the
And what
mainstream
I'm saying,
historians they also they label Vikings as the bloodthirsty people. They were raiders and they were nothing more. But in reality, there was economics going on behind behind their raiding.
yeah, economics becomes top secret. Isn't that strange? We're
Yes.
supposed to think in terms of war and not economics, like the Silk Road was
Mhm,
secured by the Mongolian Empire.
mhm,
And what that was securing trading. So people could send their wagons on the Silk Road and get their goods back. They would send, let's say, um, porcelain, some silk, and then they could get back tin. They
mhm,
and and they could get back what was something else that was valuable from the West. They could get back gold and silver, and
uh,
the exports from India were gems. India has a
yes,
lot of precious stones
and spices,
and spices,
salt. Yes,
the spice trade.
yeah.
But the West, and this is what the world has against England and the United States and France, they're drug pushers.
Mhm,
So when they came over to the United States, what did they want to sell? Tobacco, a dangerous drug.
mhm. Mhm,
What did they want to trade with China? Opium. They wanted China to buy opium.
mhm,
So and today this drug trade, which the East Indian Company did, today this
mhm,
drug trade is now vaccines.
mhm,
Everyone in the world is supposed to buy vaccines now instead of opium.
mhm.
It's the same oligarchs. It's the
Mm.
same Western preoccupation with damaging drugs.
Mhm. The time is changed, but the reason, the concept of waging the war is the same. Is
Economics.
to, yes, economics, make people addicted to your product, so they keep using it over and over again.
Now, that's the point. And the West is famous for that. The West is
Yes.
famous for pushing their product, causing an addiction, and then
Mhm.
conquering.
Just like
That's going
if
on
you,
now. And
just
now
like if you,
China and India are the biggest promoters of it.
mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm,
you go to a hospital, you in the United States, you could get a Chinese or Indian doctor who will promote the drugs more than the American doctor.
mm-hmm.
So the world has been conquered by the drug companies.
Yeah. So what
And
about
Buddhism has
look at
evolved.
look at look at the technology. People are addicted to the social media platform. They keep checking it. They want to buy new apps. They want to buy new technology, new mobile. But the reason behind the same is addiction. People are addicted to those platforms.
Yeah, computer games. People are
Yes,
addicted to computer games.
yes,
And there's deeper questions which I don't want to get into in this video because they're already pretty close to an hour.
yes.
But I think I helped you to understand that the Mongols and the Vikings were not just raiders. They
Mhm,
are here today. Russia is the result of the Viking Empire.
mhm.
And
And
the Byzantine Empire just went north. The Greek Catholics converted themselves to Russian Orthodox,
mhm.
and
So
the whole Mongol and Viking empires rose about as the Christians of the Mediterranean, the Latin and the Greek Christians started to kill each other, and that was the Fourth Crusade came to a head. The Fourth Crusade was Christians killing Christians.
mhm.
It had
But
gone so
what is
crazy.
yes, what about okay, I understand, but there's one more thing I would like to add. When Vikings were taking over the world, when they were raiding, okay, you call it raiding, or they were trading or whatever, there was Christianity was spreading in Scandinavia in 11th or 12th century.
Yeah, I couldn't hear everything. Your voice went out, faded.
Okay. Uh, Christianity was spreading in Scandinavia when Vikings were raiding other parts of the world.
Yes, they became Christians.
Yes. So isn't it
And what we
strange?
see in Russia, we see that with the Russian Orthodox.
Hmm. So we
And
have okay. I think we have discussed in detail about about the Mongol Empire and the Viking Empire and and in the Middle Ages or Dark Ages, and the reason they were successful and they were hitting, or the mainstream historian don't talk about is the is bias. They don't want to accept the Chinese, the Eastern, that they were more smart and they had the technology, tech advantage of that time in the Middle Ages. So
yeah,
I think we have discussed. mm,
well, I want to
we
add
have
one
covered.
thing. This
Okay.
this is being rejected by mainstream historians.
Yes.
There is a possibility, and people have posted videos and documentaries on this, that the Mongols were part of another country called Tartaria. There's a
Hmm.
possibility, in Mongolia and Siberia in
mhm,
warmer weather times. There was a
mhm,
major empire like the Khazarian. There was a Khazarian empire that was Jewish in Central Europe.
mhm.
That's ignored. The
Yeah.
Khazarian empire is ignored in history. And there may have been a Tartarian empire that
Mhm,
projected the Mongols.
mhm,
Now, I
mhm.
don't have historical evidence for it, but
Because
I see that possibility.
it was, after all, the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. Many historical record was destroyed, or many parts of the world who had the advantage, tech advantage, or any other advantage, they didn't want to share it with the world. Just like they didn't want to, the Chinese invented the gunpowder and the guns and cannons much earlier, in the first and second AD, but the world didn't know this, and they kept it secret all the time because they didn't want their enemies to invent the same weapon.
Yes. I mean, if they would keep China, which is porcelain dishes and pots, secret
Hmm.
for a
Hmm.
thousand years, of course they're
Hmm.
going to keep gunpowder secret as long as possible.
Yes,
But the
and
West
because
knows the West, the Western historians, for the
they
most
knew
part, are
they knew
lying. They're
yes.
not telling the truth.
Just like they didn't accept the engineering skill, the ingenuity, and the and the advantage of the Vikings. They always call them raiders, bloodthirsty people. In fact, they were very smart, they were organized, they were powerful, and they had the advantage of shipbuilding.
Well, I don't think their shipbuilding was the advantage, though. They did do build ships.
Hmm.
Viking ships were not as good as the Romans. I think the
Hmm.
Romans were better in shipbuilding.
Hmm.
I think the advantage of the Vikings was their metallurgy and that they
Yeah.
were big. They were
Yeah.
just bigger people, and that for some reason that's hidden,
Hmm. So
which
I
was
think we have.
in
I
hand to
think we
hand
have.
combat, your size made a big difference.
Yes, yes, you're right. And I think we have covered enough today,
Yeah.
and we'll move on to the other episode of globalization and history of globalization in the next week. If you have any question, leave it in the comment box below. I'll answer it to you, or Ed will get back to you as soon as he can. Okay, bye now. Have fun.
Okay. Bye.
Okay.